In the quiet outskirts of Waco, Texas, in the early 1990s, a small religious community lived under the shadow of secrecy and devotion. They were known as the Branch Davidians, a sect that had splintered from the Seventh-day Adventist Church decades earlier. At the center of this community stood a man whose name would soon become infamous, David Koresh. Charismatic, enigmatic, and deeply persuasive, Koresh had risen to lead the Branch Davidians with a singular vision, a vision rooted in apocalyptic prophecy, strict adherence to his interpretation of the Bible, and an unwavering belief in the necessity of preparation for the end of the world. Under his leadership, the community transformed from a secluded religious group into a tightly controlled society, with every aspect of daily life dictated by Koresh's teachings. For outsiders, the Branch Davidians were largely a mystery. Waco was a city known for its sleepy streets and warm Texas summers, but the compound on Mount Carmel Road was unlike anything residents had seen. Hidden behind fences and trees, the compound resembled a small fortress, its buildings carefully maintained yet fortified in ways that would later alarm federal authorities. Rumors circulated about weapons and strict control over the members, yet most locals who glimpsed life inside only saw a group of devoted followers practicing their faith. It was a paradox. The Branch Davidians projected normalcy outwardly while cultivating an intensely insular and apocalyptic culture within. David Koresh, born Vernon Wayne Howell, had arrived at Mount Carmel in the early 1980s, claiming a divine calling. His doctrine was both complex and compelling. Koresh taught that the end times were imminent, that the prophecies of the Bible must be interpreted literally, and that he alone could unlock the mysteries hidden in the scriptures. Followers, many of whom had experienced hardship, loneliness, or disillusionment with mainstream religion, were drawn to him like moths to a flame. To them, Koresh represented certainty in an uncertain world, a guide through spiritual peril who promised salvation through obedience, devotion, and preparation. By the early 1990s, Koresh's control over the Branch Davidians had solidified. The compound housed men, women, and children, each assigned roles according to Koresh's religious and practical directives. Life was highly regimented. Study sessions dissected passages of scripture, chores maintained the compound, and military-style drills ensured readiness. Koresh's teachings went beyond conventional Christianity, emphasizing not just faith, but the necessity of armed preparedness. He warned that the outside world would inevitably persecute them, that government forces could not be trusted, and that survival required discipline, secrecy, and unwavering loyalty. In essence, he was building not just a community, but a fortress of belief, physical and spiritual. Yet, beneath the surface of devotion and ritual, tension simmered. Weapons were stockpiled, followers lived under intense psychological control, and Koresh's interpretations of the Bible demanded both faith and fear. For law enforcement, this combination was a warning sign. For the Branch Davidians, it was simply life under divine authority. By 1993, these tensions would explode into one of the most infamous confrontations in American history, a confrontation that would end in death, destruction, and a national reckoning over religious freedom, law enforcement, and the limits of belief. Life inside the Mount Carmel compound was a study in contrasts. From the outside, it might have seemed like a normal rural Texas homestead, with children playing in the sun and adults tending gardens or repairing buildings. But those who lived within its walls knew that every moment was framed by David Koresh's exacting rules. Daily routines revolved around prayer, Bible study, and preparation for the apocalypse, which Koresh referred to as the inevitable judgment day. He interpreted scripture with meticulous precision, often connecting Old Testament prophecy to current events, convincing his followers that they were living in the final days of human history. Children were indoctrinated from an early age. They were taught to recite passages of scripture, memorize the teachings of Koresh, and view the outside world as inherently dangerous. Adolescents learned to handle firearms under strict supervision, understanding that the need for defense was both spiritual and practical. Adults were divided into groups with specific responsibilities. Some maintained the compound's infrastructure, others tended to livestock, and a select few were entrusted with guarding Koresh's personal quarters and inner circle. Every task, no matter how mundane, was presented as preparation for the coming apocalypse. Despite the rigid structure, there was a sense of purpose that many members found irresistible.
Koresh's charisma was central to this. He spoke with authority, blending religious prophecy with personal magnetism, ensuring that questioning his directives was inconceivable. His followers described him as patient yet commanding, compassionate yet unyielding. In his sermons, he often invoked images of martyrdom and divine favor, creating a system in which obedience equaled spiritual elevation. To challenge Koresh was not only dangerous socially, it was framed as risking one's eternal soul. Life was also punctuated by moments of communal intimacy and celebration. Followers would gather for shared meals, weddings, or religious festivals, fostering loyalty and emotional bonds. Music, song, and storytelling were infused with lessons of faith and vigilance, blending ordinary human joy with the ever-present undercurrent of Koresh's apocalyptic message. But even in these moments, the undercurrent of fear persisted. Any misstep, question, or perceived doubt could result in correction, public shaming, or exclusion from critical community activities. The constant oscillation between warmth and fear created psychological dependence on Koresh and the compound itself. Financially and materially, the Branch Davidians were largely self-sufficient. They cultivated gardens, raised livestock, and produced crafts to trade with nearby towns. Yet under Koresh's leadership, resources were strictly managed and monitored. All income, donations, and supplies were accounted for, often controlled by a small inner circle loyal to him. Koresh maintained ultimate authority over wealth, property, and food distribution, ensuring that no one could challenge his leadership or act independently. This combination of self-sufficiency, spiritual devotion, and controlled dependence made the compound both resilient and isolated.
The outside world, meanwhile, remained a source of both fascination and suspicion. Koresh warned that outsiders, particularly government agents, journalists, or local authorities, were threats to their spiritual mission. Followers were taught to be vigilant, to watch for spies, and to understand that any interference could bring divine judgment. Yet some Branch Davidians did maintain connections outside the compound, sending children to public schools or engaging in commerce with nearby residents. These tenuous interactions reinforced the sense of a looming threat, while providing a lifeline for survival, creating a delicate balance between insularity and necessity. As the 1990s progressed, tension between the Branch Davidians and law enforcement began to mount. Reports of illegal weapons, stockpiling, and Koresh's apocalyptic rhetoric reached local and federal authorities. For Koresh and his followers, these reports were interpreted as confirmation of prophecy. The world was hostile, the end times were imminent, and their preparations were divinely justified. For authorities, however, the combination of firearms, a heavily fortified compound, and potential violations of law demanded attention. What began as curiosity and concern slowly escalated toward confrontation, with each side perceiving the other as both an obstacle and a threat. Mount Carmel in those years was more than a religious community. It was a microcosm of belief, fear, and control. Koresh's interpretations of scripture intertwined with everyday life, blurring the lines between spiritual devotion and psychological manipulation. Every follower was both a believer and a participant in a complex system of obedience, surveillance, and preparation for an end that only Koresh claimed to fully understand. This intricate tapestry of faith, control, and anticipation would set the stage for one of the most infamous standoffs in modern American history. By February 1993, tensions between the Branch Davidians and law enforcement had reached a breaking point. Reports of illegal firearms and alleged abuse of minors prompted the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, to plan a raid on Mount Carmel. On February 28th, the ATF attempted to execute a search and arrest operation, expecting minimal resistance. But the Branch Davidians, deeply suspicious of outsiders and trained in firearms, were prepared. What began as a raid quickly erupted into a violent firefight. 4 ATF agents were killed, and several Davidians were injured. The failed raid shocked the nation and set off a standoff that would last 51 days. During the siege, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, took command of negotiations, attempting to secure a peaceful resolution. Negotiators spoke daily with David Koresh, trying to convince him to release hostages and surrender. Koresh, however, remained steadfast, framing the confrontation as a cosmic struggle between his faithful followers and a corrupt world. He used the time to continue his religious teachings, reinforcing the notion that the outside world was evil and that only through steadfast faith could salvation be achieved. Inside Mount Carmel, life continued under increasingly harsh conditions. Supplies ran low, tensions escalated, and fear mingled with devotion as followers struggled to reconcile the outside threat with their commitment to Koresh's prophecy.
Throughout the siege, media coverage intensified the drama. News helicopters circled overhead, reporters broadcast live images of the compound, and the public watched in fascination and horror. For many outside observers, the situation seemed surreal. Armed children and adults living under the shadow of apocalypse, negotiating with government officials while surrounded by heavily fortified defenses. Koresh's charisma and the Davidians' loyalty complicated every attempt at resolution, creating a cycle in which patience, faith, and tension intertwined, making peaceful surrender increasingly unlikely. The siege reached its tragic climax on April 19, 1993. After weeks of negotiation, the FBI launched a final assault, using tear gas to flush the occupants from the compound. Fire broke out under contested circumstances, engulfing Mount Carmel. By the end, 76 people, including David Koresh, men, women, and children, had died. The inferno destroyed not only the physical compound, but also the insular world that Koresh had created. The images of flames consuming Mount Carmel were seared into the national consciousness, a dramatic and horrifying end to a community built on faith, fear, and control. In the aftermath, investigations, lawsuits, and public debates questioned who bore responsibility. Critics condemned law enforcement for their tactics, while others blamed Koresh for the deaths of his followers. Survivors struggled to rebuild their lives, carrying both trauma and the memories of a world that had demanded complete devotion. The Waco Siege became a symbol of the dangers of religious extremism, the limits of governmental intervention, and the tragic consequences when belief and authority collide.
Decades later, the story of the Branch Davidians remains a cautionary tale. Scholars, journalists, and filmmakers continue to analyze the psychological, social, and theological dynamics that led to such a devastating confrontation. Mount Carmel's rise and fall illustrates the power of charismatic leadership, the perils of isolation, and the cataclysmic consequences when fear, faith, and firearms converge. The Waco Siege is remembered not only for its immediate tragedy, but for the enduring questions it raises about belief, obedience, and the delicate balance between liberty and authority.